Rafe, thank you very much for joining me. How are you doing?
Doing very well. Glad to have more than 3 or 4 minutes to speak with you on
I know,
this
it's
occasion.
excellent,
So
isn't
that's
it?
great.
It's
They
no,
always put
hopefully
me
no
on
one
the
from
end.
GB News is listening to this, Rafe, because they'll be very annoyed that I said that. But listen, it's the way in which we're going at the moment. The whole idea of the British state, of British history, of the monarchy, the well, of course, being a key pillar of the British state. That's all pretty much frowned upon at the moment. And if you saw the Republican debates actually coming through to the fore in Australia, who, as a Western nation, has its same struggles with those debates in their country as we do here, especially with younger generations. But this is what King Charles actually had to endure whilst he was out there um, last week. So the even the Express, Rafe, are saying that 14 countries abandoning the monarchy for republicanism, posting that as if the Australia is going to be the next one to go. Now, Australians that I've actually spoken to say that this is a total load of nonsense, and that actually they don't suspect Australia to do that anytime soon, if at all, especially given how popular the Prince and Princess of Wales are. So I'm just wondering what feeling you're getting, because there was also that awful heckling incident in which one of the senators in Australia heckled the king. Do you see a growing movement for republicanism
You're
across
right.
the former British overseas territories?
Quite the opposite, actually. Republicanism has been the biggest political failure of modern times. For the last few years, we had about a third of Australians wanted to become a republic tomorrow, another third wanted to keep the monarchy forever, and the remainder either didn't care or wanted to kick the issue down the road. And we were told for the last 20 years, when Queen Elizabeth II dies, inevitably Australia will become a republic. Well, I'm afraid to tell them that support for the monarchy has increased since Her
Mm.
late Majesty's sad death. So now we have 45% rather than a third of Australians saying that they do not want to become a republic. More Australians are proud of the monarchy than are ashamed of it. More think it's a good thing than a bad thing, and a majority of Australians have a positive attitude to the monarchy. And most interestingly, 75% of Australians do not believe that Australia will become a republic in their own lifetimes. To put this in another way, support for the monarchy in Australia is higher now than it was in 1999 when they had a referendum on the subject. It's at the highest level since 1979. So people like Graham Smith, the Australian-born head of the Republic Organisation over here, he went to Australia and there he was, a lone man flying his awful yellow jaundiced flag, and yet there was a sea of 10,000 people who had come out to see the royal family. The Republicans were calling this a farewell tour. I think we can call it a victory tour, actually.
Well, Rafe, one question that I always get from viewers is saying that actually the problem with the monarchy as it stands is the politics of His Majesty the King. As someone that is a keen environmentalist, actually the King cannot become the emblem or the figurehead, for want of a better word, of movement which will make the British people both colder and poorer. How do you sort of square that up? Do you just make the argument that actually the monarchy, the institution, is bigger than the person that wears the crown?
Yeah, so two things here. Firstly, you're quite right. So the monarchy, the crown, is more than just the king. The crown is the royal family. The crown is the governor generals and all of the Commonwealth realms. The crown, in fact, is the source of authority for all of our legal system and our police and our army and everything else. So it's more than just one person. And look, we can disagree with the king on his views. Look, he was a very active man as Prince of Wales, but he's not a stupid man. He knows full well that as king, he can't be the activist he was as Prince of Wales. And so he certainly modified and restrained himself as king. But I have issues with a lot of the position that His Majesty takes. It's worth pointing out, however, that His Majesty is actually in tune with the British public on this. And all of
Yeah.
the polling shows actually that the King's views are shared by the majority of the British public. They may not be our views necessarily on all issues, but he actually is. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why it was so unfair for that obnoxious, hideous woman, Lydia Thorpe in Australia, the most ludicrous and absurd politician in the Commonwealth, to do what she did when she heckled him in Parliament. Because we've never had a sovereign, a member of the royal family, who has been so sympathetic to the indigenous peoples, from the Maori in New Zealand to the Aborigines to the Native Americans in Canada. And so to accuse him of all these vile, the calumnies as she did, I think was so unfair, because he is actually the greatest friend of the Aboriginal peoples.
Yeah, indeed. What could she possibly disagree with him on? There seem to be a whole host of issues in which they're perfectly aligned. But the next question I want to put to you, Rafe, is one that we've heard before, and one that's been coming to the fore of conversations for many years now, but we've never had a foreign secretary who seems broadly supportive of the aims and objectives of the activists, what I would call race-baiting activists, who push these narratives. And you know exactly what I'm talking about, Rafe, because I'm talking about this. Now, Keir Starmer has today warned of endless rows if Commonwealth members push reparation claims. Now, the Prime Minister said that he would rather roll up his sleeves and work with them on current future-facing challenges than spend a lot of time on the past. And that was him there speaking to reporters on a flight to the gathering of Commonwealth leaders in Samoa. Now, the fact of the matter here, Rafe, is that we've never had a government more broadly supportive, or who have at least been historically supportive of these kinds of claims. How worried should we be about this?
Well, we should be worried to a degree. Remember, this is a government, as you said, that is fundamentally at its soul anti-British. It's ashamed of our past, it's embarrassed of our past, rather than celebrating the fact that Britain created the modern world. Britain, through the British Empire, lifted more people out of poverty than any other country in history. But of course, this is a prime minister who's taking down portraits of our greatest heroes, from the Thatcher to Elizabeth I, Sir Walter Raleigh, Gladstone, even William Shakespeare now has come down. But of course, he knows full well that it is political suicide for him to actually support reparations, because, despite their great majority in a huge number of seats, the reform is yet nipping at its rear. And if Labour was ever to go down the reparations path, you would see reform take over Labour's lead in many of those constituencies, and there will be a great sea change in Labour's fortunes, despite what they think. People need to remind David Mastermind Lammy that being foreign secretary doesn't mean you have to be foreign. I think he's got confused with the name foreign secretary. He's not Caribbean. He's supposed to be British, advancing British interests as foreign secretary, not advancing the interests of his ancestors and forebears. And in fact, he comes from Guyana, and actually the period when his family were alleged to have been enslaved was done by the Dutch, not by the British anyway. So if he does have the grievance, he should take it over to the Netherlands and give Wilders rather than having it with us.
Well, good luck with that.
Britain doesn't owe... Yeah, exactly. I'd like to see that discussion.
Yeah, I would too.
Britain doesn't owe a single penny to anybody in the world in terms of reparations. Let that be clear. We spent a sum equivalent to £20 billion today, 20 million at the time, 43% of the entire budget of 1833, freeing the slaves. We then spent 2% of GDP, a sum equivalent to our entire modern defense budget, on the West Africa Squadron, which is how we enforced an end to the slave trade, seizing foreign ships, and also, importantly, compelling the Africans to stop enslaving other Africans. Africans were the ones most opposed to the end of the slave trade. And in fact, there were more Africans held in bondage by other Africans than were ever transported across the Atlantic. Of course, we never hear that. But I think this was the first time in human history that a power had made itself deliberately poorer in order to advance the moral good. And I think we should all be proud of that. And instead of Sadiq Khan erecting a monument to slavery in London, there should be a monument to the West Africa Squadron, celebrating the fact that despite slavery being universal, the British were unique because that missionary Anglican zeal went through us in the 19th century and made us realize that all people are the equal and should be liberated.
What do you think, Rafe, the ultimate end destination is if we continue to allow much of our academic output and much of our educational system, I'm talking early years, not just academia, to be intoxicated by the fumes of a really repugnant and I think, frankly, racist attitude that says that Britain is a unique evil to the world, the British Empire was a unique evil to the world, and raise a generation, or rear a generation off of the teat of a really divisive form of politics.
Yeah, let's be clear here. We have the most radically left wing youth in history. We have never seen anything like this before. And for the first time in history, the youth are not becoming more conservative as they get older. It used to be said that if you're not a liberal at 25, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative at 35, you have no brain. Well, that brain has gone because, of course, capitalism has failed them. They can't get on the housing ladder. They don't have pensions. They don't have job security. So for many reasons, they're leaning left. But the rise of left-wing youth mirrors the rise of the left-wing teaching profession and the left-wing in academia. When I was in the secondary school, we had a fairly good balance. In fact, it might have leaned slightly to the right. But now 90% of teachers vote for left-wing parties, and children learn by osmosis. And so, for example, the number one issue, according to the youth of Britain, isn't climate change, it's racism. They think racism is the number one issue in this country, even though Britain is the world's third least racist nation. So you're quite right. We have a massive issue in this country, and we cannot keep talking about university as being the issue. As Aristotle said, give me a boy of 7 and I will show you the man. It's in your childhood that these attitudes and beliefs and values are set. We really need to tackle the schools, and we need to tackle teacher training, the profession. This is where the rot sets in. If we want to save Western civilization, if we want to save Britain, we need to actually win the battle for young minds. And unfortunately, for the last 30 years, departments of education at universities have taken over teacher training. I call them the woke madrasas. This is where teachers are being indoctrinated into all of this. It needs to start there. University is too late. As I like to say, if the hair is blue, there's nothing you can do. You need to get them.
I like that. Rafe, have you ever considered a career in politics? Have you ever considered standing for Parliament?
No party would allow it.
I think you're wrong. Listen, you should see my comment section right now. They love you. They absolutely love you. We should make you some form of, you advise what the curriculum should say about British history, because it would be a damn sight better than the absolute gruel that kids are being force-fed these days.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the problem is if you become a politician, you have to toe the party line, and I could never do that. I want to be a free spirit and talk openly, and I could never say things that I don't believe in. But something needs to be done. And it's quite ironic that in many ways, the EU and Europe are becoming more aware and alert to all of this sort of stuff from immigration onwards than we are here. And it seems often as if it's at the moment, whether you believe him or not, in many ways, Robert Jenrick is the only one talking sense in this country, when you even have, EU leaders now sounding more conservative and more right-wing even than Reform UK.
Well, yeah. How the tables have turned, eh? The progressives. I wonder if Sir Keir Starmer is going to be calling Brussels far right any moment now. But Rafe, can I end by asking you about that story that we've been talking about today, which is the case of Chris Kaba. Now, one MP stood up in Parliament and she said that the media was guilty of racist tropes in speaking about Mr. Kaba. Now, you've just mentioned there that Britain is not a racist country. Do you think that the British press are racist?
I think the British press are anti-white, so they are racist on that level. It's quite clear. I mean, we know that for a fact because if this had been a white person who had been shot in this manner, this wouldn't be a news story at all. It would be tomorrow. It would have been last week's fish and chip paper, essentially. There is clearly racism in this country, and it's targeted against white people. I mean, for example, you see this through all strata in society. Whenever the police or councils come out with these anti-grooming gang videos, for example, they always have white men as being actually the perpetrators of all of this. There's a concerted effort to try to cast, for some reason, the white working class particularly as being the source of all evil, hence this new myth about the rise of the so-called far right. And yet, of course, we know that the greatest threats to our culture aren't coming from the indigenous white population. They're coming from people who are coming from culturally incompatible nations. And yet all of that is swept under the rug. And all of the real issues that are facing this country, which we can quite clearly see what the reasons are for that, are being placed upon the shoulders of the most disadvantaged people in our society, white working class boys, for example, who we know are the most disadvantaged. And yet, of course, that's the media narrative has to be something contrary to that, because we have to understand that all of our institutions have been captured. The long march through the institutions is an Anglosphere phenomenon. The woke mind virus, which started in America, is transmitted through the English language. That's why it's most prevalent in the Anglosphere and in Scandinavia, where everyone is also bilingual. And it's only by trying to either to reverse the long march through the institutions, or ideally for the right to actually now build our own institutions, our own private colleges, as they've done in America with Hillsdale and so forth, but also with media outlets like yours. This is where I think that more and more decent British people are turning to, because you can no longer trust the establishment media. I mean, for example, the BBC put out that message about Chris Carber having traumatized black communities now with that verdict. Well,
Yeah.
the BBC were then fact-checked on that by Twitter's community notes, and the BBC then turned off their comments on the tweet, and they turned off their comments on the Facebook post. And if the BBC is turning off tweets and responses, you know that something has fundamentally changed in what we once called the mainstream media.
Exactly. And that's exactly why they're coming for X. That's exactly why they are seeking to regulate platforms like YouTube to actually kick off so-called disinformation. Well, I tell you what, if the BBC gets a free pass all of the time and they are guilty purveyors of this so-called disinformation, how about you just let us have free speech and actually come to conclusions for ourselves through argument, debate, and the advancement of thought and ideas? They're just scared, Rafe, right? They fear the new media coming to the fore and actually challenging them and challenging the cosy liberal consensus. And I think that can't come soon enough. But Rafe, listen, thank you very much for your time today, and we'll have to get you back on because they're going crazy in the chat box. Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, they'll follow you on X. It's Rafe. What's your handle, Rafe? Remind me.
It's RAFHM. Very simple.
Very, very simple. All right, Rafe. Cheers very much for your company. I'll see you
Pleasure.
soon.
Thanks so much, Darren. Cheerio.
Have you got what it takes to be a reasoned presenter? Well, send us a short clip of yourself to join@reasoned.uk and we might be seeing you on this very channel very soon indeed.